Hi there. My name is Denis McManus. I teach at the philosophy department at the University of Southampton. My talk for you today is entitled Being Oneself, Being with Others, and Being Oneself with Others. Now, the notion of being oneself is, in some respects, very familiar. We talk about someone being themselves, or, didn't you think that so-and-so wasn't being themselves today? So we use it often enough in the course of our ordinary lives, but at the same time it can be rather perplexing when we start to think about it. But some of the ideas involved would seem to be things such as self-expression, is someone expressing themselves in their words and their deeds. Self-knowledge, are they aware of themselves? Do they understand themselves, or are they not themselves in that they're estranged from themselves? Self-determination, some sort of notion that the person who is themselves is determining the course of their own lives for themselves in a way that maybe those of us who aren't being ourselves are not. Also notions about taking responsibility for your actions. So if you are being yourself, you are taking on the burden of being accountable for what you do. All of these ideas seem to be in some way rolled into this rather cloudy notion of being oneself. And another notion that's often mentioned in connection with this idea is authenticity. Now, authenticity is an idea that is particularly associated with what's known as the existentialist tradition in philosophy, in modern philosophy. So that's normally understood to have certain great luminaries within it. Kierkegaard is the first one there. Nietzsche is the second. The fourth one is Jean-Paul Sartre. But I'm going to principally be talking about the third one here, Martin Heidegger. But first, let's just look at the broader notion of authenticity and a central theme within the discussions of all of these philosophers. And that is some sort of notion that being oneself is endangered by our being with others, our social life. So the worry that in some way conformism is one of the key dangers, one of the key factors that prevents us from being ourselves. So we'll be looking at this notion that one's social life is in some way threatening to being ourselves, and as I put it here, put it in the title, being with others as a threat to being oneself. You'll see why I use that expression in a moment. So this notion of conformism can be seen running through these different authors. So we find Kierkegaard, for instance, saying we find it much easier and safer to be like others, to become a copy, a number, along with the crowd. Nietzsche thinks that we find it much easier and safer to belong to the mass, no more individual than factory products. So you have this notion of a certain kind of tension between being oneself and, if you like, immersing oneself in the social world that one finds around one. But this notion of authenticity as being oneself as a if you like an antisocial value, one that involves a certain kind of distancing from one society. You're expressing yourself, you're being yourself. You're not, as it were, just merely taking on the views of others. This can also be a rather worrying notion, and in two particular ways, because authenticity, being oneself, can seem to be positively antisocial in that it can seem to suggest a certain kind of narcissism or an egoistic kind of fixation on oneself rather than on, say, the needs of others. It can also seem to involve a rather sort of fantastical vision of what human life is really like. So it seems to involve a certain vision of human beings as isolated atoms which can exist in isolation. So, for instance, a well-known example of the criticism of authenticity as a kind of egoism or narcissism came from Christopher Lash's book, The Culture of Narcissism. And he claims that we see in the ideal of authenticity, the ideal of being oneself, what he calls the predatory individualism that he thinks lies behind the narcissistic culture of our time, which justifies self-absorption as authenticity. So the idea is, there seems to be some sort of value in being oneself, but there is correspondingly a danger that this is really just a front for a certain kind of selfishness, a certain kind of individualism, a certain kind of narcissism. But as I mentioned, there's also a worry that not only might authenticity be immoral, it might be also kind of crazy. It might seem to rest upon a vision of human beings that's unsustainable. So we are familiar with a certain kind of thought within philosophy, especially in social contract theories in political philosophy, a certain vision of this is one of the main advocates of such a view, Thomas Hobbes. In that kind of view, we get this vision of society as, if you like, an artificial add-on to the autonomous individual. So we're first and foremost individuals, and then we may then subsequently form social relations with each other. Hobbes is one example of this kind of view. John Locke's another. This certain kind of atomistic vision of human beings, which, as I say, is kind of particularly influential in the social contract theory and political philosophy. But it's, in some respects, I think, can seem a very old-fashioned notion, because we feel that our vision of what human beings are now is as thoroughly social creatures. So we're social down to the bones. Our brains are the way that they are to deal with social life. Social life isn't an add-on. Instead, we are social animals. So Darwin there, just as an illustration of the general development of the human sciences over the last couple of centuries, pointing to the fact that the isolated individual may be a bit of a myth. But this is actually a very old thought. So Aristotle, for instance, said that man is by nature a political animal, by which he meant belongs to the polis, the city, the community. So although, if you like, modern science casts doubt on the idea of the isolated individual, it's a thought that's been around for millennia. We'll come back to Aristotle later. Now, as I say, I'm going to principally concentrate on the third figure in this list, Martin Heidegger, and just talk a little bit about the way in which these issues manifest themselves in his philosophy, and some of the difficulties it seems to leave him with, and then one possible way of understanding what he's saying whereby he doesn't face this problem of how is it possible to be oneself and be with others. So how can one be oneself with others, as I put it in the title. A brief word about a couple of terms. Heidegger will talk about Dasein. This is a horribly complicated term, but for our purposes, all you need to think of it as meaning is us, creatures like us. So it's his label for creatures like us. He uses it for reasons I won't go into, but they're to do with the way in which he thinks that when we think of ourselves as, say, a thinking being, consciousness, or even a rational animal, we're starting to kind of load up our understanding of ourselves with questionable philosophical presumptions. So he uses this term Dasein. For our purposes, just go with it. Where you see Dasein, it just means us. The second key term is das Man, and I'll explain that when we get there, but I just thought I'd warn you in advance. So we see this notion of being oneself, of authenticity in Heidegger. So he talks about how Dasein, that's us, Dasein always understands itself in terms of a possibility of itself. What is that possibility? To be itself or not itself. When we're inauthentic, he thinks no one is himself. So you come across lines like this. He says, when inauthentic, what someone is and how he is nobody. No one and yet everyone with one another. Everyone is not himself. So you have this idea of being oneself and failing to be oneself. We also see the theme of conformism in some way or other at work here. So Kierkegaard has the crowd, sometimes talk about the public. Nietzsche has the mass, as we talked about earlier. He also sometimes talks about the herd. That's Nietzsche for you. Heidegger has das Man. Now this term is sometimes translated as the they, sometimes as the anyone. What Heidegger's done with this expression is man is basically the German equivalent of one. When we say, it's not I, you, he or she, it's one. So one doesn't eat with one's elbows on the table. he takes that expression, the equivalent of one, and turns it into a noun. So he talks about das Man, which, as I say, sometimes it's talked. The reason people sometimes talk about the they is because we also quite often substitute they for one when we say well, you know what they say, when we might say you know what one says. Translating it as the one would be even more mystifying. But let's just look at some of the things that Heidegger says, and you'll see this kind of sort of recognizable conformist sounding themes coming through. So he says, I've left man untranslated here. So he says, we take pleasure and enjoy ourselves as one takes pleasure. We read, see, and judge about literature and art as one sees and judges. Likewise, we find shocking what one finds shocking. So there seems to be this notion of certain kinds of general ways of carrying on into line with which we fall when we're inauthentic. And when that happens, what happens is that Das Man, says Heidegger, relieves Dasein of its choice, its formation of judgments, and its estimation of values. It determines how and what one sees and governs every interpretation of the world and of Dasein. So you have this kind of vision of Das Man kind of taking charge, taking over, dominating. Through this, everything gets obscured, he says, as Dasein is blinded to the heart of the matter. Dasein is lost, absorbed, tranquilized by Das Man. I mentioned already that authenticity runs into certain familiar criticisms, certain familiar worries. The narcissism worry, or the egoist worry, and the worry that in some way or other rests on a false picture of human beings. You get both of these in reactions to Heidegger. So just look at the first one. This is Hannah Arendt, who claims that when authentic, as Heidegger understands it, what happens when we realize that all that matters ultimately is myself. Similarly, this is Iris Murdoch in an unpublished book that she wrote on Heidegger. Hopefully it will appear eventually. She says that in Heidegger, a concern with goodness is absent. The heart is lacking the essential connection with goodness. Heidegger omits any conception of goodness or virtue or duty from the start. He amputates any serious consideration of morality, she says. But you also get the worry about whether this vision is plausible, rest on a plausible picture of human beings. And it comes up in a very striking way because Heidegger seems to make life extremely difficult for himself in this regard, because he really stresses that human beings, Dasein, is a social creature, is a social animal. So he stresses the notion that we belong to a world. So we're not, for those of you who know about Descartes, we're not isolated little thinkers who may sometimes think about the world around us. Instead, we're always immersed in a world. It's part of the fabric of creatures like us that we belong to a world. So being in a world is something that belongs essentially. So he has this concept of being in the world. More specifically, he thinks that Dasein's basic existence is one of being in the world, which is also being with others. So it's an essential feature of the world that we're in that is populated by other Dasein, that we share it with others. Our mode of existence is Mitsein, is with being, and is not often translated as being with others. So he says the world is always the one that I share with others. The world of Dasein is a with world. Being in is being with others. So we're essentially social creatures. We're essentially tied up with one another. Now, this might make you think, well, hang on, what about Das Man? A minute ago we were hearing about how, if you like, something like the crowd or something like the public was a threat to our authenticity. So it looks like there's a contrasting between our authenticity and our being with others. Well, Heidegger just ups the ante further by saying that Das Man belongs to Dasein's positive constitution. He seems to say that this herd, this mass, which on the one hand seems to be representing a threat to our being ourselves, he says, no, it's really built into us. But then you wonder, well, how can you be authentic at all if this thing that's going to undermine your being yourself somehow written into the fabric of your existence. So if Das Man belongs to Dasein's positive constitution. And this is something that Hannah Arendt presses in particular. So she says, in Heidegger, our fellow men are presented as, I'm sort of slightly glossing what she says, our fellow men are presented as an element of existence that's structurally necessary. So being with others is essential to us. But at the same time, it's an impediment to the being of self. So similarly, it's another remark which presses this point. She says, Dasein could be truly itself only if it could pull back from its being in the world into itself. So pull back from its being with others into itself. But that is what its nature can never permit it to do, if you buy what Heidegger says elsewhere. So she says, Heidegger himself has refuted this passionate desire, bred of hubris, to become a self. For never before has a philosophy shown as clearly as his that this goal is presumably the one thing that man can never achieve. So there seems to be this odd feature about Heidegger that he's that on the one hand he's stressing being oneself. He also seems to suggest that in certain ways being with others is a threat to that, but he's also saying that being with others is essential to us. So we end up with this puzzle of how can one be oneself and be with others. So as you might put it, how can one be oneself with others? How can you be both of these things? Now, Heidegger, as I mentioned, is normally seen as standing in this tradition with Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre. But in some respects, his influences may not be the ones that you might expect, given those other figures with whom he's normally associated. So he's very influenced by, for instance, early Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy. And a key figure is Aristotle again. So here Aristotle reappears. And I'm going to draw on Aristotle to offer us a different conception of what being oneself might be, which I think squares with what Heidegger has to say. And I think it informs what Heidegger has to say about authenticity. I think it's Heidegger's ideas about authenticity are in some way built on ideas from Aristotle. A key concept that I'm going to introduce you to, maybe you're already familiar with it, is the notion of phronesis. This is sometimes translated as practical wisdom. It's a key idea in Aristotle's Ethics. And on the basis of this notion, I'm going to present you with a different notion of being oneself, different notion of what it is to express oneself, based on Aristotle, and which, as I've said, I think lies at the heart of what Heidegger is also up to. So what is phronesis? Well, it's a capacity, according to Aristotle, that guides our actions, and it guides our actions in the light of an understanding not of particular goals, of what sorts of things promote health or strength, for instance, but of living well in general. So it seems to be something like a capacity to take in all the different kinds of objectives and all the other different kinds of goals you might have and pull them together to decide what should be done here now, what is best, what should be done here right now. So this is Heidegger's gloss on it in some of his lectures. The phronimos, the person who exercises phronesis, act not in relation to particular kinds of usefulness which promote Dasein in a particular regard, but instead with regard to how such a Dasein should act as such and as a whole. So I think a useful concept for us, maybe a bit more familiar for us, is the notion of an all things considered judgment. When you exercise phronesis, you don't just evaluate, if you like, what the situation that you're in requires of you, say, as a parent or as an employee or as a friend. What you do is you evaluate the situation you're in as a whole. You pull together all the obligations that you have as a friend, as an employee, etc. You pull them all together and settle, okay, in light of all of those, what should I do? So it's an all things considered judgment. Now, we find in Heidegger's reading of Aristotle a particular understanding of how those who exercise phronesis, those who make all things considered judgments, express themselves. So what I'm going to suggest is that key to Heidegger's understanding of what it is to be oneself is the exercise of phronesis, is a readiness to make all things considered judgments. Well, why should making all things considered judgments be a matter of self-expression. In what sense do I express myself when I make those judgments? Well, here's an argument that Heidegger extracts from Aristotle. So he has us imagine ourselves asking ourselves, what does it take for we as hearers to hear a speaker to be himself bearing witness to the matter that he represents, to judge that the speaker speaks for the matter with his person? So the question is, what do we have to see? What do we have to hear from a speaker for us to believe that they are, if you like, speaking on their own behalf? Are they expressing themselves? And the suggestion that Heidegger takes from Aristotle is that what we need to see is we need to see them saying what is best. And we need to see them making all things considered judgments. So a speaker can recommend something as useful, that he believes is useful, and yet the hearer can notice in the course of discourse that the speaker does not bring himself to say what is best. As a result, says Heidegger, the hearer withdraws his trust from the speaker because the speaker screens his own position. So the thought is, unless you make all things considered judgments, you are in some sense or other screening your own position. Something to note here is that it's the concern here for Heidegger and for Aristotle, I think, is not about lying. It's not that somebody has made these judgments and is keeping them to themselves. As we'll see as we go on, the notion of being oneself at work here seems to be more that to be oneself, one has to make all things considered judgments, and one of the ways in which we can fail to be ourselves is by failing to make these judgments, failing to settle for ourselves, perhaps just in our own inner dialogue. We don't settle for ourselves what's best in the situation that we find ourselves in. So how should that be the case? Why should we think that the person who doesn't bring themselves to say what is best is screening their position, is not expressing themselves? Well, Heidegger goes on. In the counsel that such a person delivers, in what this person says, he holds back what his phronesis makes available to him. He is satisfied with presenting a serious proposal, though not the best. So he might say, to be a good employee here, what you would need to do is X. Or to be a good father here, what you need to do is Y. But what this person is not saying is what they actually think should be done. In fact, we might naturally say to somebody, yes, you're saying that to be a good father you should do X, or that to be a good employee you should do Y. But what do you think you should do? What do you yourself think you should do? And it looks like what we're looking for is for this person to say not just, well, as a father I should do that, or as an employee I should do that, but all things considered, what I should do is X. So the thought seems to be that when you make an all things considered judgment, that is when you really express yourself. So if the person was simply saying to you, well, as a father I should do X, we can still now ask that person, yes, but what do you think ought to be done? Because, as Heidegger puts it, the speaker does not say everything and knows still more. So you might say, well, as a father what I should do is X, but I know that I shouldn't do X because as an employee I should do Y, and that's much more important here. But that, if you like, replying to the speaker by saying, yes, but what do you think, doesn't make sense if the person does say what is best. So if the person does say, okay, well, I think all things considered, what should be done here is X. If you then say, yeah, but what do you think should be done? That doesn't seem to make any sense. And that seems to be because when somebody does make an all things considered judgment, when they do say, well, I think all things considered, what should be done here, they have said everything. There isn't any more that they know that they're holding back. So there is no room for them to say, well, all things considered, I think what should be done here is X. All things, sorry, I'm trying to get this right for you. If the person says, all things considered, what should be done here is X, but I think we should do Y, this is a very perplexing notion. That, but I think Y should take place, we should do Y instead, only makes sense if the person has not said everything, has not if the person does know still more. But if this person has expressed an all things considered judgment, then they haven't, because it's all things considered. So the thought here is that I express myself when I make an all things considered judgment. I express, if you like, all of myself when I make an all things considered judgment. Not just part of myself, not just, if you like, the fragment of me that is a father, or the fragment of me that's an employee. When I express myself, what I do is I express myself as a father, as an employee, as a son, as a neighbour, as a friend, and so on. I pull all these considerations together. So in that sense, I'm expressing all of myself. Now, I think we get the same notion in Heidegger too. And one way in which this comes out is that Heidegger will say that authenticity is a matter of being whole. So the authentic are whole in a way that the inauthentic aren't. He says the inauthentic life is one of dispersal, distraction, disconnected. You live, as he puts it, as unganzes, so as less than a whole. You have a sort of fragmentary life. And the falling away of Dasein from its authenticity, he says, is a falling apart of Dasein. And you see this also in Aristotle. So he'll talk about the way in which the phronomos, the person who exercises phronesis, the person who makes all things considered judgment, they act in the full situation in which they act, in like the situation that they find themselves in the largest sense. So they don't just look at it as a father would or as an employee would. They look at it in light of all of the things that they themselves are, all the different roles and commitments they've got. So they see the whole of the state of affairs. They attain an overall view of the moment that they're in as a whole. So now what then does inauthenticity end up looking like? Well, I'm going to give you an example. This is a predicament in which I sometimes find myself, a great big pile of marking in front of me. And that's going to be part of my little story. The kind of thing that inauthenticity turns out to be on this account is a condition in which we don't make all things considered judgments. We allow our attention to be captured, if you like, by certain obligations we've got, the demands of certain roles. And there are reasons why we do this. And one of them is, for instance, to go back to some of the notion mentioned earlier, there's a certain kind of evasion of responsibility that it makes possible. So imagine this situation. Obviously, it wouldn't really happen to me, but let's go with it. Imagine there I am with a big pile of marking in front of me, and my wife comes to talk to me because she's got some concerns at work. My son comes to talk to me, and he's having an argument with his friend. He wants me to, he wants to talk about it. Or my neighbour rings up and he says, we're meant to do some work together. When are we going to get on with it? And what I do in response is I say, no, look, I've got to do my marking. I have to do my marking. And I might back it up by saying, look, anyone who's a teacher should do their marking. One should do one's marking. Now, this may not be, if you like, me making an all things considered judgment. Instead, what it will be is me evading that very demand. It's me saying, no, look, I've got to do my marking. I have to do my marking. And, of course, I do have to do my marking because, I'm employed as a teacher at a university, so I do have to do my marking. But what's deceptive about that kind of reaction to this situation is that I'm kind of blurring out other real demands of me. Other real things, if you like, other real facets of myself. I'm blurring them out, as you'll see in a moment. Heidegger talks about dimming down. So I'm dimming down the fact that I'm also a father with obligations to my son, a neighbour with obligations to my neighbour, a husband with obligations to my wife. What I'm saying is no, look, I've got to do my marking. I have to do my marking. And because, of course, one should do one's marking. It is a generally accepted maxim in our society. My wife accepts it, my son accepts it, my neighbour accepts it. We all accept it. I have to do my marking. But what's deceptive about this, what makes this inauthenticity on this account, is that I'm embracing this one obligation. I should do my marking. Why? Because, one should do one's marking. So I'm refusing to engage with all the other obligations that I have. And this is, as I say, recognisably it's a recognizable kind of evasion of responsibility. I'm presenting my reaction to this situation as not something that I've decided. I've got to do it. I've got no choice in the matter. This isn't something it's not a decision I should be held responsible for. It's an obligation. It's an irresistible obligation. But of course, that's not what it is, because I have other obligations, and they may trump this one here. But I'm refusing to engage with it, because I'm not just a teacher. I am a teacher, so I do need to do my marking, but I'm not just a teacher. I myself am a multifaceted whole. We all are. And you see this kind of theme in Heidegger when he'll say things like this. He says, when I'm inauthentic, I understand myself in terms of those very closest events and befallings which I encounter and which thrust themselves upon me, he says. I abandon myself to whatever the day may bring, and I cling to what is proximately at my everyday disposal. I'm distracted by, I'm lost in the objects of my closest concern. So if you like, I turn to my marking and I cling to my marking. I allow the marking to, if you like, grab me, take me over. I allow the marking to determine how I'm going to act. And in so doing, I discount my other obligations. I disavow my responsibility for what I'm doing. So we've got this idea of authenticity as bringing all of one's thoughts and feelings about one's situation to bear. I'm not dimming down any of these. I'm not dimming down any of my recognition of my obligations to my son or my wife or my neighbour, whoever it might be. I recognize them all. When I'm authentic, I recognize them all, I pull them all together, and I decide. I make the often very difficult judgments. Phronesis is a difficult capacity to exercise. I make this difficult judgment as to which of these many competing obligations impose themselves on me. When I'm inauthentic, I resist that need. I resist that need to decide by allowing myself to be just captured by particular obligations. So, rewording that thought, authenticity is bringing together in a judgment of what overall I should do, all the obligations that come with all the roles that I occupy and all the goals that I pursue. I'm not dimming any of them down. I can't act on them all because I'm a finite creature, but I will at least have pulled them all together in a judgment of what matters most here. Now, I think this will echo, with some of the things that we talked about earlier. So we do seem to get a recognizable notion of, if you like, falling back on certain general notion of how a person ought to behave, of how one ought to behave in this kind of example. I say, I have to do my marking because one should do one's marking. And this seems to be captured quite well when Heidegger talks about Das Man relieving Dasein of its choice, its formation of judgments, its estimation of values, and so forth. Everything gets obscured. Dasein is blinded to the heart of the matter. Why say that? Well, because, I'm saying, I've got to do my marking. But it could be that that's not the most important thing. That's not the heart of the matter. But I'm allowing myself to be captivated by certain obligations and dimming down the rest. Now, what I think the consequence of this is, you'll notice that these obligations that I'm weighing up in deciding how to act, they don't have to be selfish. It doesn't involve any sort of turning of your back on the needs of others. The kinds of obligations I'm weighing there are things like being a father, being an employee, so my duties to my students, my duties to my neighbour. These are all, if you like, other regarding concerns. Now, when you pull together your many goals and your many objectives, some of them might be selfish. But this notion of self-expression, the idea that you express yourself when you pull all of your obligations together, there's no commitment in that to the idea that these goals have to be selfish, self-regarding, that you in some way, that the authentic person pushes away other people. Instead, on this picture, what the authentic person does is they consider, if you like, fully and seriously what their obligations to other people really are. So which other people they should be helping here, which of the demands that others rightly place on us should be taken into account. So this seems to be a notion of being oneself that allows us to also be with others. It's a notion of being oneself with others. Now, I'm conscious that I mustn't go on too long with this talk. One of the questions that people might well want to talk about a little bit more is this question of, in what sense is this still a kind of conformism? And just as to whet your appetite, I think the answer is it a kind of inauthenticity? Well, yes and no, and then yes again. But I'll leave that as a tantalizing or annoying end note on which to finish, and I look forward to hearing what you make of these ideas. Thank you.